The earth did not care that a woman was grieving. It demanded to be turned regardless, and Grace Carter had learned that lesson with blood blistered into her palms and salt dried white on her cheeks. It was the spring of 1878 in the panhandle country of Texas, where the sky stretched so wide and indifferent that a person could feel themselves shrinking just by looking up at it. The land around the Carter homestead was stubborn red clay mixed with sandy loam, the kind of ground that resisted the plow like it had a grudge, and the kind of ground that, if you could break it, would give you something worth having. Grace Carter intended to have something worth having. She had no other choice. Thomas Carter had died 11 months ago, in a late spring rainstorm that had done nothing but mock the drought that came after. He had been thrown from his horse, a simple and stupid accident on familiar ground, and the earth that Grace was now trying to break had swallowed him whole before she had time to make sense of any of it. He had left her with 40 acres of patchy homestead, a mule named Job who was old and ornery and had died himself 6 weeks later, a daughter named Ellie who was 7 years old and slept with her fists curled tight under her chin, and a debt to the bank in Clover Creek that would come due in the fall. Grace was 31 years old. She had brown hair the color of weathered cedar that she kept pinned back while she worked, and she had green eyes that people had called pretty before she stopped noticing whether people were calling her anything at all. She was not a large woman, but she was a strong one in the quiet way that people become strong when they have no alternative. And on this April morning in 1878, she had fashioned a crude harness out of rope and leather strapping, and secured herself to the handles of Thomas's old walking plow, and was pulling it herself across the south field. She had tried to hire the Morrow boy from the neighboring property, but the Morrow family was in their own trouble, and she had no money to spare anyway. She had considered writing to her sister in Missouri, but her pride would not let her, and the truth was that even if her sister came, it would solve nothing because someone still had to turn this ground. She had looked at the plow for 3 days before she picked up the rope. And now she was in it, leaning forward with her whole weight, her boots digging into the red earth, her arms straining in their sockets, and the blade catching and dragging through the resistant ground in a way that made every step feel like an argument she was winning barely. She did not see the man at the fence line until she turned at the end of the row. He was sitting on a dark roan horse at the cedar post fence that marked the edge of her property from the old Sanderson Road. He was not moving. He was just sitting there, one hand resting easy on the saddle horn, watching her, and when she turned and saw him, she felt the familiar flash of a woman alone seeing a stranger, that particular calculation that ran through her body without her permission. He was wearing a plain brown canvas duster that had seen considerable country, and a battered hat with the brim shaped by weather rather than intention. He was broad through the shoulders and lean in the face, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and a jaw that carried a few days of dark stubble. She could not tell his age at this distance, but he did not have the look of an old man. He also did not have the look of a man passing through, because a man passing through does not stop and stay stopped. Grace straightened her back, which screamed at her for it, and she put her hands on her hips and looked at him across the length of her field. He did not move on. She walked toward him, because she was not a woman who waited for things to come to her anymore, not since waiting had shown her what it yielded. She unhooked herself from the rope harness as she walked and let it drag behind her, and by the time she reached the fence she was close enough to see that his eyes were a steady gray-blue, the color of sky before a front moves in, and that he was looking at her with an expression that was hard to read but was not threatening and was not mocking. It was something closer to troubled, as though what he was seeing was working something out in him. "This is private property," Grace said. Her voice was level. She was good at level. "Yes, ma'am," he said, "I can see that. The road's behind you. I know it." She waited. He seemed to be deciding something. The roan horse dropped its head and pulled at a clump of dry grass near the fence post, and he let it. "I watched you plow that last row," he said finally. "On your own. I am aware of what I was doing." "Yes, ma'am." He took his hat off, which surprised her because men did not generally take their hats off to talk to a woman with dirt on her face and rope burns on her hands in the middle of a field. He held it against his thigh. "My name is Simon Donovan. I have been working a cattle drive up from the lower country, and I am between places at the moment." He paused. "I am a fair hand with a plow." Grace looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved across the field between them and brought with it the smell of turned earth and dry grass and the particular emptiness of open country. "A fair hand," she repeated. "Better than fair," he said, and there was not arrogance in it, just honesty. "I have been breaking sod since I was old enough to hold a handle. I am not a charity case, Mr. Donovan." "No, ma'am, I can see that too." His eyes moved briefly to the rope harness she had fashioned, lying on the turned earth behind her, and then came back to her face. "I am not offering charity. I am looking for work and a place to sleep that is not open sky until I figure out where I am headed next." Grace Carter looked at this man, this Simon Donovan with his steady eyes and his hat in his hands, and his claim of being between places, and she ran through the arithmetic of her situation with the swift practicality that grief and necessity had taught her. She needed the south field and the east field both broken before May. She had no money to pay a hand. She had the small bunkhouse that Thomas had built in his first year here, which currently housed 3 chickens and a broken wagon wheel and nothing else. She had no money, but she did have a root cellar and she could cook, and she was a woman alone with a 7-year-old daughter and a debt coming due in the fall, and she was currently pulling her own plow. "I cannot pay wages," she said. "Room and board is enough for now. The bunkhouse has chickens in it. I have slept in worse company." Something in her chest moved, just barely, the way a door moves when there is wind on the other side of it. She did not let it move her face. "You will start at first light," she said, "and I will want to know that my daughter is safe." His expression changed then, and what replaced the previous neutrality was something serious and clean. "You have my word on that, Mrs. Carter. I have a mother and 3 sisters, and I know what that question costs a woman to ask." Grace nodded once, because that was all the acknowledgement the moment required. "Come around to the house then, Mr. Donovan. I will show you where things are." She turned and walked back across the field, and she did not look back to see if he followed, but she heard the quiet creak of saddle leather as he dismounted, and the soft sound of hooves on the road as he led his horse around to the gate, and she felt the strange weight of a decision settling into her life, the way all significant decisions settle, quietly, and with the feeling of being both right and irreversible. Ellie was on the porch with her doll when Grace came back across the yard, and she stood up with the particular alertness of a child who has learned to pay attention to new arrivals. She had her father's light brown hair and her mother's eyes, and she watched Simon Donovan come through the gate leading his horse with the frank assessment that children have before they learn to disguise it. "Ellie," Grace said, "this is Mr. Simon Donovan. He is going to help with the plowing." Simon crouched down, which meant he was eye level with Ellie, which was a thing Grace noticed. "How do you do?" he said, with a formality that was genuine rather than performed. Ellie looked at him. "What is your horse's name?" "Copper. That is a good name," Ellie said, with the weight of someone delivering a considered verdict. "He is very red." "He is," Simon agreed seriously. Ellie looked at her mother, then back at Simon. "Do you know how to fix a wagon wheel?" Grace closed her eyes briefly. Simon looked up at Grace, a question in his expression, and Grace said, "There is one in the bunkhouse. It has been there since winter." "I expect I can look at it," Simon said to Ellie. Ellie nodded as though this settled something. She sat back down with her doll, apparently satisfied, and Grace led Simon to the bunkhouse and showed him the small space with its rope bed and its single window and its current population of 3 unconcerned chickens. "I will move the chickens to the coop tonight," Grace said. "I do not mind them," Simon said. He was looking at the wagon wheel, which had a cracked hub and a missing spoke. He turned it with one hand, assessing. "I can fix this," he said. "I will need some materials from town, but I can fix it." "There is no money for materials from town," He nodded slowly, still looking at the wheel. "I might know a way around that. We will see." That night Grace cooked salt pork and beans and cornbread, and Simon Donovan ate at the table with her and Ellie. The way a man eats when he has been eating trail food for a long time, with a quiet gratitude that he kept entirely contained. He helped Ellie with a knot she was trying to make in a piece of string after supper, his big hands patient with her small ones. And when Grace told Ellie it was time for bed, Simon stood when Ellie stood, which was another thing Grace noticed, because Thomas had done that too, and it was the kind of thing that meant something about how a man had been raised. After Ellie was in bed, Grace sat at the kitchen table with the lamp and went over the ledger she kept in Thomas's handwriting and hers mixed together, the numbers going in opposite directions from what she needed them to go. She heard Simon in the bunkhouse, the occasional sound of movement, and it was strange to have that sound again, the sound of another adult in the near dark, and she sat with that strangeness until the lamp burned low, and then she went to bed and lay listening to the wind in the cedar brakes until she slept. Simon was already in the south field with the plow at first light, and Grace watched him from the kitchen window while she made biscuits and felt something she could not immediately name, which turned out, when she had time to examine it later, to be relief. The uncomplicated animal relief of not being entirely alone with a problem. He could plow. That was immediately apparent. He worked the ground with a steadiness that spoke of long familiarity, reading the soil before he committed to each row, adjusting the blade angle for the clay sections, giving the horse Copper his head in the easier stretches. By mid-morning he had done what would have taken Grace the better part of 2 days. She brought him water in a tin cup, and he drank it standing in the field with his duster off, his shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows. And for a brief moment Grace Carter noticed that he was a handsome man in an uncurated way, the way a landscape is handsome. And then she took the cup back and went about her day, because she had no room in the architecture of her survival for that kind of noticing. At noon she brought food out and they ate in the shade of the live oak at the field's edge, and he asked about the soil and about the crops she was planting, corn and sorghum and a kitchen garden, and he asked practical questions with genuine interest, and offered a few observations about what might do better in this particular ground. And Grace found herself talking about the land with the fluency she had developed over 8 years of working it. And it was not until she caught herself mid-sentence that she realized this was the longest sustained conversation she had engaged in with another adult in several months. He glanced at her when she stopped. "I have not talked that much in a while," she said, which was more honest than she intended. "It shows you know the land," he said simply. "Thomas and I used to talk about it at the end of every day," she said, and then she was surprised she had said Thomas's name to this stranger, because she had learned to hold it carefully. Simon did not offer condolences in the careful performative way that people had been offering them for 11 months, which she had come to find quietly unbearable. He just said, "How long were you two on this place?" "8 years, since we were married." "You built something," he said, looking across the fields and the house and the outbuildings with a simple, appraising eye. "I am trying to keep it," Grace said. He looked at her then, and there was something in his expression that was close to understanding, not the surface understanding of sympathy, but the deeper understanding of someone who knows what it costs to hold on to something. "You will," he said, and he said it not like an encouragement but like a statement of observable fact, and for reasons she could not entirely account for, Grace believed him. The days fell into a rhythm that Grace had not expected to find comforting, but which was. Simon was up before her and worked through the morning, and in the afternoons they sometimes worked together on the east field or on the kitchen garden plot, and Ellie began to trail behind Simon in the early evenings when he was tending to Copper, asking him questions with the relentless specificity of a 7-year-old who has identified a person who will answer them seriously. On the third evening, Grace overheard Simon explaining to Ellie the difference between a gelding and a mare in perfectly appropriate and clear terms, while he was brushing Copper down. And Ellie was absorbing this information with solemn concentration. And Grace stood in the doorway of the barn, feeling the edge of something she did not want to feel yet, a warmth she was not ready for and could not afford. She went and stood at the fence by the south field instead, looking out at the turned earth, and after a while Simon came and stood beside her. He did not speak immediately. The sky was going red and orange and deep purple in the west, the way Texas skies do in the spring, in colors that seem invented by someone showing off. "You do not have to tell me anything," he said eventually, "but I am wondering about the debt." Grace looked at him sideways. She had not mentioned the debt to him specifically, though she supposed it was implied by the general circumstances. "What about it? How much and when?" She told him. He was quiet for a moment. "That is manageable if the corn comes in. If," she said. "There is a lot of if in this country." "There is a lot of if everywhere," he said. "But this ground is better than it looks. I have worked worse." He paused. "I would like to stay through harvest if you will have me." Grace was quiet for a moment that was long enough to be meaningful. "Why?" she asked, because she thought she deserved a straight answer. He turned and looked at her directly, the way he seemed to do everything without evasion. "Because this is a good place," he said, "and because I think you could use the help and I could use the staying." "What is chasing you?" she asked, because a man who was not chasing something did not describe himself as needing to stay. Something moved across his face. He looked back out at the field. "Nothing criminal," he said. "I should say that first." "All right." "I had a place," he said slowly, feeling his way through it. "Down in the hill country. Partner and I were running cattle together. It went bad, not in a violent way, but in a way that meant I could not stay. And I have been moving since October, and I am tired of moving." He paused. "That is the whole of it." Grace nodded. She believed him, which surprised her somewhat because she had grown cautious about men and their explanations. "But has had the shape of truth, plain and a little worn at the edges, the way real things are. Through harvest," she said, "and we will see." He nodded once, and they stood in the evening light looking at the field she was trying to save, and the comfortable silence between them felt like something neither of them had expected to find. 2 weeks in, the trouble with Hale Briggs began. Hale Briggs was not a man Grace Carter feared exactly, but he was a man she was wary of, which in Texas in 1878 was a careful distinction worth maintaining. He owned the land directly to the north, and had made 2 offers on the Carter property since Thomas died, both of which Grace had refused, and he had received those refusals with a politeness that had something hard underneath it. He was not a violent man by reputation, but he was a determined one, and in the particular mathematics of the frontier, land and water and weather and debt all worked together in ways that a determined man could exploit if he was patient enough. Briggs rode up to the Carter fence on a Thursday afternoon when Simon was in town at the smithy attempting to trade labor for the materials he needed for the wagon wheel, and Grace was in the kitchen garden with Ellie, and Briggs sat his horse at the fence and called out, and Grace came. He was a big man in his 40s with a thick gray mustache and the air of someone accustomed to getting what he waited for. He tipped his hat at Grace with a courtesy that was technically polite. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "I see you have a hand working your fields." "I do," Grace said. "Hired man. He is working for room and board while he passes through," Grace said, which was true enough. Briggs nodded slowly. "My offer stands," he said. "On the property, you would get a fair price and you would not have to carry this alone." "I am managing," Grace said. "For now," Briggs said, not unkindly, which was the most threatening way he could have said it. "Fall comes fast out here, Mrs. Carter, and banks do not accommodate widows the way you might hope." He paused. "I am not trying to pressure you. I just want you to know the offer is standing." "I appreciate you making it clear," Grace said, with a composure that cost her something. He tipped his hat again and rode north, and Grace stood at the fence watching him go and felt the cold weight of what fall would mean if the corn did not come in, if something went wrong, if the bank had no patience, and the fear she normally kept in its locked room in her chest rattled its door for a moment before she put her shoulder against it and held it closed. When Simon came back from town with a small collection of iron hardware wrapped in cloth and several long pieces of good hickory wood, Grace told him about Briggs. She was not sure why she told him, except that the telling felt necessary. Simon listened without interruption, sitting on the bunkhouse step with the hardware in his lap, and when she finished he said, "Is he the kind of man who uses something other than patience?" "I do not think so," Grace said, "but I have been wrong about men before." He looked up at her at that, and she saw that he caught the layered meaning of it and chose not to press it, which was the right choice. "I will be here through harvest," he said, "and if the corn comes in you will be all right. And if it does not—" He was quiet for a moment. "Then we will figure out what comes next," he said, and the "we" in that sentence hung between them briefly, surprising both of them perhaps. "I will make supper," Grace said, and went inside. That night Grace lay in bed and thought about Thomas for a long time, the way she thought about him less and less frequently now, which produced its own particular guilt, the guilt of the living moving forward when the dead are standing still. She thought about Thomas's hands and the particular way he had laughed, and the way he had been wrong about the weather but right about the soil. And she let herself miss him fully and completely until the missing had run its course for the night, the way she had learned to do, letting it come and letting it go rather than holding it or pushing it away. And then, quietly, she thought about Simon Donovan, not with intention or permission but just the way a thought arrives in the empty dark. And she thought about the way he said "we," and about his steady hands on the plow, and about the way he had crouched down to be at Ellie's eye level. And she let that thought sit there for a moment before she went to sleep, without judgment and without encouragement, just as something that was true in that particular moment. The wagon wheel was fixed by the end of April. Simon worked on it in the evenings after field work was done, and when he rolled it out and fitted it back on the wagon and it was straight and sound, Ellie clapped her hands and Grace ran her fingers along the new spoke and felt something out of proportion to the occasion, felt it as a representation of something larger, the idea that broken things could be put back together. "Thank you," she said, and her voice had something in it she had not entirely intended, and Simon looked at her for just a moment longer than the situation strictly required. "It is a good wagon," he said. "It deserved fixing." May came in warm and dry, and Grace planted the corn and the sorghum with Simon doing the seeding behind her as she opened the rows, and they moved through the fields in the kind of synchronized work that develops between two people who have learned each other's pace, and the work itself was almost pleasant, which Grace had not expected. Ellie brought them water and occasionally attempted to help with the planting in ways that were more enthusiastic than effective, and Simon allowed her to help in the ways she could, and redirected her gently from the ways she could not. And Grace watched this from the corner of her eye, and felt the warmth she had been trying not to feel move through her, with the unhurried certainty of something that has decided to happen regardless of whether you have planned for it. In the evenings, Simon would sometimes sit on the porch after supper and play, a battered mouth harp he kept in his coat pocket. Nothing fancy, just old songs and a few things that might have been his own. And Grace would sit on the other end of the porch with her mending, and Ellie would be between them until she fell asleep in the warm air. And there would be the music and the dark and the sound of the country settling itself for the night. And Grace found these evenings to be the best part of her days in a way that she stopped trying to argue with herself about. One evening in early May, after Ellie was in bed, Simon asked Grace if she ever played cards. "Thomas and I played cribbage," she said. "I know cribbage," Simon said. She found the cards and the board in the chest in the bedroom, and they played at the kitchen table by lamplight, and the game drew conversation the way games do, because there is something in the side-by-side attention of playing that makes talking easier than talking directly. She learned that he was 34 years old, that he was from Kentucky originally, that he had come west after the war with his cousin, and then the cousin had gone back east, and Simon had stayed because he could not find a reason to go back. That he had worked cattle drives and freighting and ranching in various portions of the Western Territories and Texas for going on 12 years. That his mother was still alive in Kentucky and wrote letters that he answered when he could. That he had been engaged once to a woman in San Antonio, and that it had ended without bitterness, but with the kind of quiet grief that comes from two people who are fond of each other realizing they are not right for each other. "Is that the hill country situation you mentioned?" Grace asked. "No," he said, and there was something careful in the way he said it. "That was earlier. The hill country thing was a business partnership that went sideways. My partner decided the terms of our agreement were negotiable. They were not. I could not find a way to stay and look him in the eye." "Were you friends?" "We were," Simon said. "That was the harder part." Grace dealt the next hand. "I am sorry for that," she said simply. He looked at her with an expression she was coming to recognize, the look of a man who was not used to simple, unornamented sympathy and did not quite know what to do with it. "Thank you," he said, equally simply. Grace won the game, which she did not feel the need to mention but which she noted internally with something like satisfaction. In the second week of May, a man named Rez Calloway came through, a man who Grace recognized as one of the riders who worked for Briggs from time to time. A lean, hard man with pale eyes who had always made her uncomfortable in the unspecific way that some people do without doing anything specific to account for it. He rode up to the house on a weekday afternoon when Simon was in the east field and Grace was doing laundry at the wash basin in the yard. Calloway told her that Briggs was increasing his offer by 15% and that the offer had an expiration date of the 1st of June. Grace wrung a shirt out with her hands and looked at Calloway steadily. "Tell Mr. Briggs the answer is still no," she said. Calloway looked at her with those pale eyes for a beat longer than was comfortable. "He figured you might say that," he said. "He asked me to mention that the bank in Clover Creek has been known to call loans early when they feel uncertain about a property's future." The fear behind the door in Grace's chest hit it hard, but she kept her face exactly where it was. "Tell Mr. Briggs that this property has a very solid future," she said. "And tell him not to send men to my yard again, or I will go to town and say so at the top of my voice." Calloway touched his hat with something that was not quite a smirk and rode north. When Simon came in for supper, Grace told him about it, and this time he was quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet, more concentrated, the way a man is quiet when he is working through the implications of something. "He is putting pressure on the bank," Simon said. "He cannot make the bank call the loan early without cause," Grace said. "I have not missed a payment." "No," Simon said slowly. "But a man with influence and patience can make a bank nervous, and a nervous bank finds cause." He was quiet again for a moment. "I have a little money saved," he said. "Not a lot, but I could put it against the debt." Grace stared at him. "I will not take your money. It would not be a gift, it would be—" he stopped, seemed to be choosing words carefully. "It would be an investment in the harvest." "Simon." She used his first name, which she did not usually do, and something shifted in the air of the kitchen. "I appreciate it more than I can say, but I will not take a man's savings and risk losing them along with the land." He looked at her for a long moment, and there was something in his face that was working to stay on the surface, something that wanted to say more than the conversation had technically opened the door to. "All right," he said finally, "but tell me if it gets worse." "I will," she said, which was a concession she was making to him specifically and would not have made to many others. The corn was up by late May, small and tentative but real, actual green, pushing through the red earth in rows that Grace walked every morning like a person checking on something precious. Simon came with her sometimes, and they walked the rows in the early light and talked about what they were seeing, the color of the leaves and the spacing and the soil moisture. And these were conversations about farming and nothing else, but they had the quality of intimacy in them, the quality of two people sharing something they both care about. On the last day of May, Grace's neighbor to the east, A woman named Bertie Hatchett, who was a widow herself, and had been for 15 years, and who had survived it with a combination of stubbornness and excellent pie, came over for the afternoon. Bertie was 60 years old and had opinions about everything and kept them well armed. She sat on the porch with Grace and drank coffee and assessed Simon, who was working on the fence line between the Carter property and the Morrow property, with the frank open evaluation of a woman who had long since stopped pretending to be indirect. "He is a fine-looking man," Bertie said. "He is a good worker," Grace said. "Those things are not mutually exclusive, Grace. I know that. And he is kind to the child." Grace looked at her coffee cup. "Yes." "Thomas has been gone nearly a year," Bertie said, gently but without apology, because Bertie believed that the truth was most useful when it was not wrapped in so many softening layers that you could not find it. 11 months, Grace said, "and you are 31 years old." "Bertie, I am not pushing you," Bertie said. "I am just reminding you that you are still here and still young, and that the dead do not begrudge the living their lives, whatever we imagine they might think." She sipped her coffee. "Thomas loved you. A man who loves you does not want you to plow your own fields alone forever." Grace was quiet for a moment. "I do not know what he is," she said finally. "I do not know if he is passing through or staying or what he wants here." "Then find out," Bertie said. That evening after supper, Simon asked if he could sit with her a moment on the porch, and Grace said yes. And Ellie had already been put to bed because she had worn herself out chasing the dog that belonged to the Morrow boy, and had come over that afternoon for an hour of shouting and running that Grace had been grateful for on Ellie's behalf. Simon sat on the step and turned his hat in his hands, which Grace had come to notice was something he did when he was working up to saying something. She sat in the chair above him and waited. "I want to be honest with you," he said. "All right," Grace said. "I said I was passing through when I came here," he said, "and that was true when I said it. But I am not sure it is still true." He looked out at the dark yard and the stars beyond the tree line, which were brilliant and closed the way they are in that part of Texas where there is no town light to compete with them. "I am not sure I want to keep moving. I have been moving for a long time, and I find that I am less interested in the next place than I was." Grace waited. He was not done. "I want you to know that," he said. "I am not telling you anything beyond that. I know it has not been a year. I know I have been here less than 2 months, and that is not enough time to know anything much. But I did not want to keep being here under false pretenses, even the pretense that I was temporary." Grace was quiet for a long time. The night made its sounds, the crickets and the far-off coyotes and the soft shift of copper in his enclosure. "I appreciate you saying that," she said finally. He nodded and looked at his hat. "I am not ready for anything," she said carefully. "I want to be honest with you too. I am still," she stopped. "I am still figuring out what I am now," she said. "Without Thomas. I spent 8 years being one thing, and now I am being something else, and I have not entirely figured out what the something else is." "I am not asking you to be ready for anything," Simon said. "I am just asking to keep being here, if that is all right." "It is all right," Grace said. He put his hat on and stood up. "Good night, Mrs. Carter," he said, and there was warmth in the formality of it. "Good night, Mr. Donovan," she said, and there was warmth in her formality too. June was hot, which was not unusual, and the corn needed water, which was a constant anxiety because rain was unreliable, and the creek that ran along the property's eastern edge was running lower than it should. Simon rigged an irrigation channel from the creek to the fields using a system of shallow ditches and wooden slats that was simple and somewhat ingenious, and Grace worked beside him on it for 2 full days, and they were both muddy and sunburned by the end of it, and the channel worked. And Grace laughed when the water ran through the first time, a real laugh from somewhere deep, and Simon grinned at her with mud on his cheek, and something in Grace Carter's chest cracked open just slightly, like the shell of something that had been waiting. She did not say anything about it. But she thought about it later, lying in the dark, and she thought about Bertie's words in Thomas's absence and the particular quality of the life she was trying to build. And she let herself, for the first time, Consider the possibility that what was happening between her and Simon Donovan was not something to be afraid of. July brought a circuit preacher through Clover Creek, and Grace took Ellie to town for the Sunday service, which she did most Sundays when she could manage it, and Simon came with them, which he had not done before, sitting beside Grace on the wagon seat while Ellie sat behind them and talked continuously about a variety of subjects including the preacher's horse and the quality of clouds, and whether a cat could learn to swim. The town of Clover Creek was small, as towns in that part of Texas in 1878 generally were, with a main street of wooden storefronts and a hotel that was also a saloon and a bank and a general store and a livery, and a blacksmith, and a small white church that was used for services when there was a preacher, and for community meetings when there was not. There were perhaps 300 people in and around Clover Creek, and they had the tight social awareness of small communities, where everyone's business was observable and observed. Grace was aware of the eyes that tracked their arrival, the three of them on the wagon, and she held her posture and her dignity with the practice of a woman who had been held to account for her choices before. Several women came and greeted her warmly enough and looked at Simon with assessment ranging from curious to approving, and several men shook his hand with the firm evaluative handshake of men who are taking a measure, and Simon handled all of it with the calm ease of a man who had passed through enough communities to know how these things worked. Hale Briggs was at the service. He sat 3 rows ahead of Grace and turned once to look at her, and his eyes moved to Simon beside her, and something behind his expression recalculated. After the service, in the yard of the church where people gathered and the preacher shook hands and children ran, Briggs came to Grace. He was polished today in his Sunday clothes, and he tipped his hat to her and then extended a hand to Simon with smooth confidence. "Hale Briggs," he said. "I own the land north of Mrs. Carter's property." "Simon Donovan," Simon said, taking the hand with equal confidence. "A good hand?" Briggs asked, including Grace in the question with a glance. "An excellent one," Grace said pleasantly, which was neither confirming nor denying what Simon was exactly, and she was aware that this ambiguity was serving a purpose. Briggs's eyes moved between them and did not miss the ambiguity. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "my offer on the property remains." "My answer remains as well," Grace said, with the same pleasant tone. Briggs nodded slowly. "I understand you have had some luck with the irrigation," he said, and Grace felt the fine chill of knowing that someone had told him this, that he had eyes on her property or near it. "The corn looking good." "Very good," Grace said. "Good weather makes optimists of us all," Briggs said. "And bad weather is less forgiving." He smiled and tipped his hat and moved on, and Grace did not watch him go, but she felt him go, the way you feel a pressure releasing. "That was the man," Simon said quietly beside her. "That was him," Grace said. Simon was quiet for a moment. "He is worried," he said. "He would not have come to you in public if he was not worried." "Why would he be worried?" "Because the corn is growing," Simon said simply, "and you are not selling." On the wagon ride home, with Ellie asleep in the back, Simon said, "Is there anyone at that bank who knows you, who has dealt with you and Thomas over the years?" "The manager's name is Harold Finch," Grace said. "He was respectful enough when Thomas was alive." "It might be worth paying him a visit," Simon said. "Not about anything specific, just to be seen and to let him see that the property is being managed." Grace thought about this. It was practical advice. She nodded. "Next week," she said. "I will go." "We will go," Simon said, and again the "we" was there, easy and unannounced, and Grace let it sit in the warm July air between them without pushing it away. That evening, back at the farm, with Ellie put to bed, Grace and Simon sat on the porch, and the day's heat was finally releasing, and there was a small good breeze, and Grace said, "He is going to try the bank." "Probably," Simon said. "But he cannot force their hand if you are current on the debt and the land is being worked. He can lean on them, but a bank would rather have a performing loan than a complicated piece of property." He was quiet for a moment. "Has the corn been good enough to bring in what you need?" "If the second half of summer cooperates," Grace said. "Then we make sure it cooperates," Simon said. She looked at him sideways. You talk as though you have a stake in this." He looked at her directly the way he did and said, "I do." The simplicity of it hit her somewhere central. She looked back out at the dark fields and the stars, and she said, "Simon," and stopped. "You do not have to say anything," he said. "I know," she said. "I want to." She was quiet for a moment, finding the words in the dark the way you find things in the dark, by feeling their shape. "I am not still in grief the way I was. That is different from not grieving anymore. I want you to know that I understand the difference. But I am," she stopped again. "I am finding that I want you here. Not just the work, though I need the work. I want you here." The silence that followed was full in the way that silences are when they hold something important in them. Simon was very still. "Grace," he said quietly. It was the first time he had used her name, her given name, without the formality of Mrs. Carter, and the sound of it in his voice was something she felt in her whole body, a recognition of some kind. "I am not ready to rush anything," she said. "I am not rushing anywhere," he said. "I told you that." "I know." She turned and looked at him, and he was looking at her, and there in the warm dark of a Texas summer evening something passed between them that was acknowledged and real and unhurried. "I just needed you to know," she said. "I know now," he said quietly. They sat in the dark for a long while after that, not touching, not speaking much, just being in the same place at the same time with the same knowledge, which was more than enough for where they were. August was the cruelest and best month. The corn was tall and heavy and good, and Grace walked the rows with something close to prayer, talking to the plants under her breath the way she had seen Thomas do. And Simon checked the irrigation every morning, and they were lucky with the rain. 2 good soaking rains in August that came at exactly the right intervals. And the sorghum was good too, and the kitchen garden was overflowing in the way summer gardens do when they take the bit and run. They worked side by side through the heat with the easy familiarity of people who have learned each other's rhythms. And in the evenings they talked on the porch with Ellie between them. And sometimes they played cards. And sometimes Simon played his mouth harp, and Grace learned the words to a song she had not known before and sang it quietly while she mended. And Ellie danced in the yard to it with the uninhibited joy of a child who has been brought back into a life that has warmth in it again. On a hot August afternoon, when the light came through the sorghum stalks in long columns and the locusts were screaming their summer screaming, Simon was cutting the tall grass along the fence line, and Grace brought him water, and he took it and drank it and handed the cup back. And their hands overlapped on the cup for just a moment, and neither of them moved immediately. And Grace looked up at him in the thick golden light, and Simon looked at her, and he said, low and careful, "May I?" And Grace said, "Yes." And he kissed her, there in the August heat with the locust sound around them and the good smell of cut grass and turned earth. And it was a careful kiss and a certain one, without haste and without apology. And Grace felt it move through her like the first real rain after a long drought, something she had been waiting for without quite knowing she was waiting for it. When they stepped back from each other, Ellie's voice came from the direction of the house, calling that the dog from the Morrow property was in the yard again. And Grace pressed her hand briefly to Simon's chest and felt his heart under it. And then she went toward the house, and he went back to the fence line. And they did not speak of it for the rest of the afternoon, but it sat between them like a lamp in a room, warm and present and illuminating everything it touched. That night Grace wrote in the small journal she kept, and she wrote about Thomas with love and with gratitude, and with the specific grief of someone who has made peace with something. And she wrote about Simon with wonder, and with the tentative joy of someone who is beginning to believe that good things can happen twice. And then she closed the journal and slept better than she had in nearly a year. The harvest came in late September with the hard, organized joy of good labor repaid. Simon hired 2 day hands from town for the heavy cutting, men named Potts and Alvarado who knew what they were doing. And Grace ran the household and the kitchen to keep them all fed, and she and Ellie and Simon worked from first light until the light gave out. And by the end of the first week of October, they had more corn than Grace had dared to project, and enough sorghum to sell a significant portion. And when Grace sat down with her ledger and did the final accounting, she was quiet for a long time. She went to the bank in Clover Creek on a Wednesday in mid-October, and she took Simon with her as she had planned in July. And Harold Finch received them in his office with the expression of a man who had expected a difficult conversation and was recalibrating on the spot. Grace laid her payment on his desk with the composed exactness of a woman who has been waiting to do this for 11 months, the full installment due in the fall and a partial advance on the spring payment. And Harold Finch looked at the money and looked at Grace and then at Simon and then back at Grace. "This is in excellent order, Mrs. Carter," he said. "I expect it is," Grace said. She and Simon walked out of the bank into the October sunshine, and Grace stopped on the boardwalk and put her face up toward the sky and closed her eyes, and Simon stood beside her and let her have that moment. "You did it," he said. "We did it," she said, and she took his hand on the main street of Clover Creek where anyone might see them, and she held it, and Simon Donovan looked at her with something in his face that was close to radiant, and she thought perhaps her own face looked something like that too. Briggs rode over 2 days later. He came to the house properly this time, came to the front gate and called out, and Grace met him in the yard. Simon was visible behind her near the barn, making no pretense of not being there. Briggs took the situation in with the unhurried assessment of a man who has been in enough negotiations to know when the ground has shifted. "I hear the harvest was good," he said. "Very good," Grace said. He nodded slowly, looking at the fields, the barn, the house. "My offer is withdrawn," he said finally. "I know when a thing is settled." Grace had not expected that. She kept her face neutral but let a small nod convey her appreciation for the candor. "I appreciate you saying so," she said. Briggs looked at Simon for a moment, then back at Grace. "You have built something here, Mrs. Carter, both of you." He touched his hat. "I will not trouble you further." He rode north, and this time Grace watched him go, because she wanted to see it, wanted to see the last of the pressure go with him. And when he was out of sight, she let out a breath that seemed to have been in her lungs for 11 months. Simon came and stood beside her, and she leaned against him, just briefly, just for a moment, and his arm came around her shoulders and held her there. And the October sky was the deep clear blue of a threat that had passed. November brought cold mornings, and the good smell of wood smoke, and the particular quiet of a farm that has survived its season. The work now was the preparing work, winterizing the barn and laying in firewood, and putting up the last of the kitchen garden before the frost. And Grace and Simon worked through it with the comfortable competence of two people who have figured each other out. Ellie had accepted Simon with the wholehearted totality that children have when they have decided about a person, and she was now engaged in a sustained attempt to teach Copper to follow her without a lead, which Copper was tolerating with remarkable patience. And Simon watched these lessons with an expression of suppressed amusement that Grace had come to love seeing on his face. On a cold November Sunday afternoon, Simon asked Grace to walk with him to the south field. He was serious in a way that was different from his usual seriousness, more concentrated, and Grace went with him, and they stood at the edge of the field where they had stood so many times, where the fence post was, near the place where he had first stopped his horse, and the field was bare and brown, and the sky was a thin winter blue, and their breath made small clouds. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask," she said. "I want to stay," he said, "not as a hand." "I want to stay," as he stopped, and Grace saw him working through the words, which was something he did not often need to do, and the fact that he needed to do it now told her the weight of what he was carrying. "I want to stay as the man who loves you," he said, "if you will have me." Grace Carter looked at this man, this Simon Donovan who had stopped his horse at her fence line and not moved on, who had picked up her plow and her debt and her broken wagon wheel and her frightened heart, and held all of them with steady, careful hands. And she felt the full weight of the year that had brought them here, the grief and the fear and the slow turning of something, the way earth turns, the way seasons turn, the way people turn toward what gives them light. "I will have you," she said. He kissed her there in the cold November air, properly this time, with his hands holding her face and the bare field stretched out around them under the winter sky, and Grace Carter felt the precise sensation of a life beginning again, not replacing what had been but growing from it the way all things grow, from ground that has already known something. "There is one more thing," he said when they stepped back. "What?" "I have some money, not a great deal, but I would like to put it into this place." "Into the land, not as a loan, not as an investment," as he paused, "as a contribution, as the beginning of something I would like to build here with you." Grace looked at him carefully. "You understand what you are saying," she said. "This land has Thomas in it." "I know that," he said. "I am not trying to replace anything. I am trying to add to what is already here. If Thomas built something worth keeping, then I would like to help you keep it and build on it. That is all I am saying." Grace thought of Thomas, of the way he had talked about the land, the way he had said that good land deserved good people to work it, that it was a partnership between a family and a place, and neither could do without the other. She thought Thomas would have recognized Simon Donovan for what he was, a man of honesty and capability and quiet, steady heart, and she thought Thomas would have approved. "Then you can put your money into this place," she said, "and yourself with it." They were married in January of 1879, in the little white church in Clover Creek, on a day when the sky was a flawless cold blue, and the ground was frozen hard, and Ellie wore a dress that Bertie Hatchett had helped Grace sew from material they found at the dry goods store in Clover Creek. A good deep blue cotton that Ellie had chosen herself with the certainty of a child who knows exactly what she wants. The preacher was in town that week, which felt like fortune aligning itself for once, and Bertie stood up with Grace, and a man named Cal Potts who had helped with the harvest stood up with Simon, and the church was perhaps a quarter full with people from in and around Clover Creek who had heard about the widow and the drifter who had stopped at her fence and found something neither of them had been looking for. Harold Finch from the bank was there, which surprised Grace, but she appreciated it. Briggs was not, which also surprised no one. Simon put a ring on Grace's finger that he had ordered from a catalog in October, a simple gold band with a small inlaid pattern of leaves, and when Grace looked at it on her hand she felt it settle into its place with the rightness of something that has found where it belongs. Ellie threw dried flower petals with tremendous enthusiasm and somewhat poor aim. There was a supper afterward at Bertie Hatchett's house, which was larger and better appointed than the Carter farmhouse, and which Bertie kept warm with a ferocity that was characteristic. And people ate and talked, and the night was a good one, the kind of evening that settles into memory as a bright point, a thing you can go back to when the difficult days come. Simon carried Grace into the farmhouse that night under a sky brilliant with winter stars, and Ellie was at Bertie's for the night by mutual arrangement. And inside the house that Grace Carter had built her first life in and was now beginning her second, they found each other with the particular gratitude of two people who know the value of what they have been given, because they know what it is to not have it. February brought a letter from Simon's mother in Kentucky, a woman named Margaret Donovan, who wrote in a firm round hand that her son was long overdue to have settled down, and that she was glad of it, and that she hoped to meet Grace someday, and that she sent her love to Ellie, whom Simon had already written about in terms that apparently made it clear that the child had adopted him as thoroughly as he had adopted her. Grace wrote back to Margaret Donovan with the careful courtesy and genuine warmth that she extended to things she cared about, and she told Margaret about the farm and the harvest and the way Simon had fixed the wagon wheel and managed the irrigation. And she said that her son was an exceptional man, and that she had the good sense to recognize it when the evidence became undeniable. And Margaret Donovan wrote back in March, saying that this was the finest letter she had received in years, and that Grace was clearly exactly what she had always hoped her most stubborn son would find. The spring of 1879 was gentler than the spring of 1878, in the way that springs can be when you are not carrying everything alone. Simon and Grace planned the season together over the winter, the crops and the rotation, and a plan to expand the south field by clearing the cedar scrub along the lower fence line. And they began the clearing in March, which was hard work, but the kind Grace had come to appreciate, the kind that has a definite outcome and a visible before and after. Ellie started attending the school in Clover Creek 3 days a week, riding in on a small paint horse named Pepper that Simon had acquired in a trade with a man passing through in the winter. And the school was a one-room affair with a young teacher named Miss Hadley, who was from Missouri, and had a determined optimism about frontier education that Grace found admirable. Ellie came home from school full of new information that she delivered to her mother and Simon at the dinner table, with the urgency of someone who believes all newly acquired knowledge must be shared immediately before it gets away. Ellie had started calling Simon Pa in February, not because anyone had suggested it or arranged it, but because she simply began doing it one morning at the breakfast table and then continued doing it. And Simon had gone very still for a moment when she first said it, and then he had looked at Grace, and his face had something in it that was too full for any regular expression to hold, and Grace had looked back at him and felt the same fullness. And neither of them said anything because there was nothing to say that could match what it was. In April, Grace discovered she was pregnant. She told Simon in the evening, sitting at the kitchen table after supper, with the directness that she brought to important things. He went very still again the way he had when Ellie called him Pa, and then he reached across the table and took her hands in his and said nothing for a moment while he collected himself, and when he looked up his eyes were bright. "Grace," he said. "I know," she said, because she did know. She knew exactly what this was, what it meant, the enormity and the joy and the fear that comes with joy and the wonder of it. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am more than all right," she said. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, an old-fashioned gesture that she loved about him, and she felt the warmth of it radiate through her whole hand and up her arm and into her chest where it joined everything else that was living there now, the grief transformed into memory, and the love that had grown in its place, and the knowledge that a life rebuilt can be as whole and as real as the one it grew from. "Ellie is going to have opinions about this," Grace said. Simon laughed, a real laugh, and said, "She has opinions about everything." "She gets it from somewhere," Grace said, and raised an eyebrow at him, and he laughed again. The baby was born in November of 1879, a boy, arriving on a cold gray morning with a midwife named Mrs. Portillo from Clover Creek attending, who had brought babies into the world in this part of Texas for 20 years, and who moved through the business with the calm competence of long practice. Simon was in the house throughout, within earshot, pacing the kitchen floor with a thoroughness that had Ellie watching him from the table with the analytical interest of a child studying a new phenomenon. When Mrs. Portillo came out and told him he could come in, he went to the bedroom, and Grace was in the bed with the baby against her chest, tired and radiant in the way that women are in that particular moment. And the baby was red-faced and indignant about being in the world and was making his opinion known. And Simon sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son for the first time with an expression that Grace would remember for the rest of her life. "Hello," he said quietly to the baby, with a tenderness so complete and unguarded that Grace felt her eyes sting with it. "What shall we call him?" Grace asked. They had discussed names for months without settling on one. Simon looked at her and said, "Thomas." Grace went still. She had not suggested it, had not even let herself think it directly, afraid it would seem like too much in one direction or another. She looked at Simon for a long moment. "Thomas," she said, testing it. "Thomas James Donovan," Simon said. "James for my father." Grace felt the tears come then, not from grief but from the specific feeling of something being honored, of the past being held in the present with gentleness and respect, and she said, "Yes, that is exactly right." Ellie appeared in the doorway with the authority of someone who has been waiting her turn and said, "Can I see him now?" "Come in, Ellie," Simon said, and made room on the bed. Ellie climbed up and looked at her brother with the critical assessment she applied to most new things, and then her face softened into something purely wondering. "He is very small," she said. "He will grow," Grace said. "He looks like a potato," Ellie said. Simon made a sound that was mostly suppressed laughter. Grace said with great dignity, "He does not look like a potato." "He is a little pink and lumpy," Ellie said, in the tone of someone simply reporting observable facts. "Ellie," Simon said. "But a good potato," Ellie said graciously. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was the fullest winter Grace Carter had ever known, a word she would not have predicted she would use about winter, which had always seemed the season of endurance rather than fullness. But the house was warm, and the woodpile was deep, and Thomas James slept in the cradle that Simon had built in October from the good cedar wood he had saved from the fence line clearing. And Ellie did her schoolwork at the kitchen table, and offered running commentary on it to anyone who would listen. And Simon read aloud from the Bible in the evenings after supper, because it was the book they had, and Grace liked the sound of his voice moving through the familiar passages. And the life that Grace Carter had been trying to save had become a life she was living. The farm was in better shape than it had ever been. Simon had ideas about the land that were good ones, ideas about rotation and about the creek, and about the possibility of adding a small herd of cattle in the spring. Nothing large, just enough to diversify, and Grace had ideas about the kitchen garden, and about keeping a few pigs, and about the possibility of making some income from preserved goods at the Clover Creek Market that was held on the first Saturday of the month. They talked about these things at the table after the children were in bed, talking about the future the way people talk about a place they are building together, with the particular pleasure of two people whose visions are compatible and complementary. One evening in February of 1880, when the cold had come back hard after a brief warm spell and the fire was the heart of the room, Simon asked Grace a question he had been working up to for some time. She could tell by the way he approached it. "Do you think Thomas, your Thomas, would have been all right with this?" he asked. "With all of this?" Grace looked at him steadily. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "You are sure? He loved this land, and he loved Ellie, and he loved me," Grace said. "He would have wanted all of us cared for and the land kept. You are doing all of those things. He would have been grateful to you." Simon was quiet for a moment. "I think about him sometimes," he said. "When I am in the fields, I think about the man who broke this ground first and built the fence lines and dug the well. I feel like I know him a little through the work." Grace felt something gentle and large move through her. "That is a good way to know someone," she said softly. "I hope I am doing it justice," Simon said. "The thing he started." "You are," Grace said. "Simon, you are." He looked at her across the lamplit table, and she looked back at him, and between them was the life they had made together. The debts paid and the fields turned, and the children breathing in the next room, and the full specific weight of what they had built in the space of less than 2 years. And Grace thought of the morning she had harnessed herself to the plow and pulled it across the south field under a cold April sky. And she thought of the man who had stopped his horse at her fence and looked at what she was doing and had not moved on. She thought about all the ways a life can break and all the ways it can mend, and she thought that the mending is not the replacement of what was broken, but the building of something from those pieces that is different and whole and true in its own way. Spring came again, as it always did, with its particular combination of promise and demand, and the Carter Donovan farm, which was what people in Clover Creek had taken to calling it, went into its second season under Simon's full partnership with the steady industriousness of a place that knew itself. The cattle, a small herd of 12, arrived in April from a ranch south of Clover Creek, and Simon managed them with the practiced ease of a man who had spent years with cattle and was glad to be working cattle that were his own. Ellie named every one of them, to Simon's resigned amusement and Grace's open delight. Thomas James was sitting up by spring and grabbing at everything within reach, with a determined enthusiasm that suggested he would be mobile and opinionated long before anyone was ready for it. And Ellie took her position as older sister with a seriousness that occasionally veered into the managerial, but which was fundamentally loving and attentive in the way that made Grace's heart ache with gratitude. Bertie Hatchett came to supper every Sunday and had opinions about everything, which was exactly what she was supposed to do, and she told Grace in private that she was looking well, that she had a different quality now, and Grace said that she was happy, and Bertie said that she could see that clearly and that it suited her, and that Thomas would have said the same, and Grace said that she knew, and they sat together in the comfortable understanding of two women who have both known loss and are both, in their different ways, still here. In the summer of 1880, a letter came from Simon's mother Margaret asking if there was any possibility of a visit, and Grace wrote back immediately saying that there was every possibility, and that she would be very glad of it, and that the children would be glad of it also. And Margaret Donovan arrived on the stage in Clover Creek in September, a small determined woman with Simon's eyes, and an immediately evident opinion of Grace that was warm and plain and unpretentious, which was exactly what Grace had hoped for and what she got. Margaret held Thomas James with the practiced ease of a woman who had raised several children, and told him he had his father's forehead, and she told Ellie that she had beautiful eyes and that she had heard about the naming of the cattle, and considered it a sign of strong character, and she told Grace privately, in the kitchen, that she had been worried about her son for a long time, and that she could see now that the worrying was over, and she said this last part with a simplicity that contained a great deal. "He is a good man," Grace said. "He is," Margaret said. "He always was. He just needed something worth staying for." Grace looked out the kitchen window at Simon in the yard with Ellie, who was showing him something she had found in the garden, a large and apparently fascinating beetle, and Simon was examining it with serious interest, and Grace felt the warmth of the whole picture. This man and her daughter and her son in the next room and this new family member at her kitchen table, and she thought that this was it. This was the something worth staying for. This ordinary, extraordinary collection of people and work and love that filled a house and a field and a life, all the way to the edges. Margaret stayed for 3 weeks and went back to Kentucky with the promise of letters and a standing invitation to return, and Simon walked her to the stage in Clover Creek and stood watching it go with the expression of a man who has made his peace with the fact that the life he has chosen is here, and the people who are elsewhere remain beloved and far, and that is the shape of a life sometimes, and it can be good anyway. The harvest of 1880 was the best the Carter Donovan farm had produced, the corn heavy and the sorghum strong, and the kitchen garden so overflowing that Grace had been selling preserves at the Clover Creek market since July and had established herself as something of an authority on preserved peaches, which she made from the tree Thomas had planted in the first year of the homestead, and which produced every summer with the reliable generosity of a well-placed tree. She stood at the market in October with her jars lined up and Thomas James on her hip, asleep in the way babies sleep, completely and without reservation, and Ellie beside her keeping an unofficial and rather vocal account of sales. And when Simon came through the market with a man he had been talking to about grazing rights on the lower pasture, he caught Grace's eye across the crowded Saturday market and smiled at her with the specific warmth of a man who sees the thing he loves and is not shy about it. And Grace smiled back at him the same way, not shy about it at all. She thought about the woman she had been in April of 1878, harnessing herself to a plow and pulling it across a field she was terrified of losing, and she thought about the woman she was now, standing in the Clover Creek market with her children and her jars of preserved peaches, and a husband who smiled at her across a crowd like she was the thing his eyes were looking for. Both women were her. She had not left one to become the other. She had carried everything forward and found that it was all still there, grief and love and memory and hope, all of it together in the same life, which turned out to be large enough to hold it all. That evening, with the children in bed and the fire low and the early October darkness sitting soft against the windows, Simon and Grace sat together on the settle that he had made over the winter, close enough that their shoulders were touching, and outside the window the farm was quiet. The cattle settled in the fields bare after harvest and the good smell of fallen leaves in the cold air, and the sky above the cedar brakes was full of stars. "We should add another room," Simon said. Grace looked at him. "Are you expecting something?" He looked back at her with the expression she loved most, the one that was both sincere and gently amused. "Are you?" Grace considered. "It is possible," she said, with a dignity that was partly undermined by the fact that she was trying not to smile. Simon laughed, quiet and warm, and pulled her into his side, and she settled against him with the ease of someone who has found the exact right place to be. And they sat together in the firelight and the comfortable dark while the farm breathed around them, while the land that Thomas Carter had broken, and Simon Donovan had tended, and Grace Carter Donovan had held through every season lay quiet and whole under the October stars. The new room would be built in the spring. The baby, another boy they would name Daniel, would arrive the following summer with the same red-faced indignation as his brother and the same capacity to be immediately and absolutely loved. Ellie would teach both her brothers to ride before they were tall enough to need a step stool. Thomas James would grow into his father's forehead, and his mother's green eyes and Ellie's talent for having opinions. Daniel would be quieter, more like his father, with steady gray-blue eyes and the manner of a person watching carefully before they commit to anything. And through all of it, through the seasons and the years and the ordinary, extraordinary accumulation of a life shared, Grace Carter Donovan would sometimes walk out to the south field at the end of a day and stand at the fence post where a man had once stopped his horse and looked at her across the turned earth, and she would feel the particular gratitude of someone who has been given back something they did not expect. And she would look back at the house where the lamplight was coming through the windows and the sound of her family was coming through the walls, and she would feel the full rightness of it, the way the earth feels when the rain finally comes, when everything that has been waiting opens up and lets it in. She had pulled her own plow once because there was no other way forward and the effort had not been in vain, and the field she had broken had yielded something she had not planted and had not expected and would not have traded for anything in the world. The land grew what it grew, sometimes grief, sometimes corn, sometimes, if you had broken enough ground and remained in one place long enough, it grew love. Grace Carter had learned that. She had learned it on a cold April morning with rope burns on her palms and a stranger on a roan horse at her fence line. She would not forget it as long as she lived.